No one spoke the janitor's name on the night everything changed, even though his blood would be the reason the CEO was still breathing when dawn arrived. The corporate headquarters stood silent beneath the storm, its glass walls trembling under sheets of rain that blurred the city into distant, trembling lights, while inside, the power of money and ambition slept uneasily. Ethan Cole moved slowly down the hallway with his cleaning cart, the steady rhythm of his work matching the quiet exhaustion in his bones, a man invisible by design, someone the world had learned to look through rather than at. To the executives who left before midnight, he was just another uniform, another shadow wiping away the traces of their long days. But to Ethan, every polished floor and emptied trash bin meant survival, meant another small step toward giving his daughter a life that would not be defined by loss the way his had been. On the top floor, behind a wall of glass and steel, Daniel Wright sat alone at his desk, the youngest CEO in the company's history, surrounded by success that felt strangely hollow, buried under numbers, deadlines, and the unspoken fear of failure that followed him even in silence. He had passed the janitor countless times without ever seeing him, never wondering who cleaned the building after everyone else went home or what kind of life waited for that man beyond the uniform. When the elevator doors opened and a stranger stepped out with rage in his eyes and a gun in his hand, time collapsed into a single breathless second. Daniel froze, stripped of power and titles, suddenly just another man facing death. From the far end of the hallway, Ethan reacted before fear could speak, his thoughts not on himself or the life he might lose, but on a little girl asleep in a small apartment, waiting for her father to come home. He stepped forward without hesitation, driven by instinct, by love, by the quiet belief that some lives were worth protecting, even at the cost of his own. The gunshot tore through the silence, sharp and final, and as Ethan fell, the world changed, setting in motion a chain of events that would transform not only the fate of two men, but the soul of an entire company forever. The gunshot echoed through the corridor long after Ethan's body hit the floor, its sound bouncing off marble and glass like a question no one was prepared to answer. Daniel Wright stood frozen, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were seeing, as blood spread quickly across the pristine tiles, staining a place that had never known anything but polished perfection. For years, this building had been his kingdom, a space where every decision bent to his will and every problem could be solved with authority or money. Yet in that moment, he was powerless, staring at a man he barely knew who had just stepped into death for him without hesitation. Ethan's breathing was shallow, ragged, each inhale a struggle, but his face was strangely calm, as if he had already accepted the price of his choice. And when his eyes fluttered open for a brief second, they met Daniel's, not with fear or anger, but with a quiet steadiness that made Daniel's chest tighten in a way he had never experienced before. Security rushed in. Shouts filled the hallway, someone called for an ambulance, and hands pressed desperately against Ethan's wound. But Daniel barely heard any of it, because all he could think was a single, unbearable truth. If not for this invisible man, his life would have ended here, unnoticed by the city that celebrated his success. As paramedics wheeled Ethan away, Daniel followed them down the corridor without realizing he was moving, his expensive shoes slipping slightly on the blood he hadn't even known was there until it was too late to ignore. In the elevator, surrounded by flashing lights and urgent voices, Daniel felt stripped of everything that had ever defined him. There was no boardroom authority, no executive confidence, only the raw terror of someone who had come face to face with mortality and survived by accident rather than merit. At the hospital, he sat alone in the waiting area long after the doctors disappeared into surgery, his hands clasped so tightly they ached, replaying the moment again and again, searching for logic where none existed. Why would a janitor, a man with nothing to gain, choose to sacrifice himself for a stranger who had never once acknowledged his existence? The question gnawed at him, breaking through layers of cynicism he had spent years building as armor. While Daniel wrestled with guilt and disbelief, another world moved quietly in parallel, unaware that anything had changed. In a small apartment across town, Lily Cole slept curled around a worn, stuffed rabbit, the nightlight casting soft shadows across her bedroom walls as rain tapped gently against the window. She had learned early how to fall asleep without her father beside her, trusting his promise that he would always come home, no matter how late his shift ran. Ethan had kissed her forehead before leaving that evening, reminding her to finish her homework in the morning and smiling in a way that hid his exhaustion, because he believed children deserved security even when adults had none. By the time dawn crept through the clouds, Lily would wake to an empty apartment and a silence that felt wrong, though she wouldn't yet understand why. Hours passed before a doctor finally approached Daniel in the waiting room, his expression careful and measured as he explained that Ethan had survived the surgery but remained in critical condition, the bullet having narrowly missed his heart. Relief washed over Daniel so suddenly it made him dizzy, followed almost immediately by shame, because he knew that relief belonged first and foremost to a child who didn't even know she was about to lose her father. When the doctor asked if he was family, Daniel hesitated, the word catching in his throat, and for the first time in his life, he realized how empty his connections truly were. He wasn't family, not in any way that mattered. Yet he felt bound to Ethan by something deeper than obligation, something that demanded more than a thank you card or a public statement. Over the next few days, Daniel learned everything he could about the man who had saved him. He spoke to hospital staff, to security guards, to anyone who might know Ethan beyond the uniform he wore, and slowly, a picture formed that stood in stark contrast to the corporate narratives Daniel was used to consuming. Ethan Cole was a single father, widowed, working nights so he could be home during the day for his daughter. He never complained about overtime, never asked for recognition, and was known for quietly helping others whenever he could, whether that meant covering shifts or fixing small things without being asked. The more Daniel listened, the heavier the weight in his chest became, because every detail painted Ethan as someone who lived by values Daniel had long dismissed as impractical. One evening, as Daniel stood outside Ethan's ICU room, watching machines rise and fall with each fragile breath, a small voice spoke behind him asking softly if her daddy was sleeping. Daniel turned to see Lily standing there, holding the hand of a nurse, her eyes wide but steady in a way that suggested she had learned to be brave too early in life. He didn't know how to answer her, didn't know how to explain the concept of critical condition or danger to someone so young, so he simply nodded and said that her father was resting and that he was very strong. Lily seemed satisfied with that, peering through the glass and whispering that her dad always kept his promises, that he would wake up soon because he had to take her to the park. The certainty in her voice struck Daniel harder than any accusation could have, because it was built on trust Ethan had earned every single day of his life. That night, Daniel returned to his office but found himself unable to focus on reports or strategy. The image of Ethan stepping forward replayed relentlessly in his mind, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about the company he had built and the man he had become while building it. He thought about the long hours, the cost-cutting measures that reduced people to numbers, the way he had convinced himself that emotional distance was necessary for success. For the first time, he questioned whether the culture he had championed was truly sustainable or merely efficient at ignoring the human cost beneath its polished surface. As Ethan remained unconscious, Daniel began making changes, small at first, then bolder, driven by a sense of responsibility that went far beyond public relations. He ordered reviews of employee benefits, wage structures, and working conditions, discovering gaps he had never bothered to look for before. When advisors warned him about expenses and shareholder reactions, Daniel surprised them by standing firm, his voice steady with a conviction he had never felt so clearly. He no longer measured success solely by growth charts or quarterly earnings, but by the faces and stories he had once overlooked. Days turned into weeks, and when Ethan finally stirred, opening his eyes to the soft beeping of machines and the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him, the first name he whispered was Lily's. Daniel was there, sitting quietly in the corner, unsure of his place but unwilling to leave, and when Ethan's gaze finally found him, there was no bitterness, only confusion and concern. Daniel stood, his throat tight, and thanked him in a voice stripped of authority and ego, acknowledging not just the act that saved his life, but the humanity that had inspired it. Ethan listened, weak but attentive, and simply asked if his daughter was okay, because for him, nothing else mattered. In that moment, Daniel understood that the true measure of a person was not how much power they held, but what they were willing to give up for those they loved. And that realization marked the beginning of a transformation that would ripple far beyond that hospital room, setting the stage for a future neither man could have imagined when the night began. When Ethan slipped back into unconsciousness, the room seemed to hold its breath, the steady hum of medical machines becoming the only proof that time was still moving forward. Daniel remained seated long after the nurses adjusted tubes and monitors, watching the rise and fall of a chest that bore the cost of a choice Daniel would spend the rest of his life trying to understand. Leaving the hospital that night felt wrong, as if walking away would somehow undo the fragile thread holding Ethan to the world. Yet responsibility pulled Daniel back toward the company that suddenly felt unfamiliar and unworthy of the sacrifice made in its name. The next morning, the headquarters buzzed with rumors, fragments of truth spreading faster than facts ever could, but Daniel said nothing publicly, refusing to reduce what had happened to a headline or an internal memo. Instead, he retreated into reflection, replaying not just the shooting, but every overlooked moment that had led there. Every time he had chosen efficiency over empathy, results over relationships. He began to notice details he had once ignored, like the fatigue in employees' eyes during early meetings, the quiet resignation of people who had learned not to expect understanding from those above them, and the invisible labor that kept the company running long after executives went home. Each observation felt like a confession, forcing Daniel to confront how far he had drifted from the ideals he once believed leadership represented. As days passed, Daniel's visits to the hospital became a routine he refused to break. Even when meetings piled up and advisors urged him to refocus, he learned Lily's schedule, the hours she was allowed to visit, and watched how she spoke to her father even when he could not respond, telling him about school, about a drawing she had made, about how brave he was. There was no fear in her voice, only trust, and that trust unsettled Daniel more deeply than anger ever could. He realized that Ethan had built something remarkable without money or influence, a bond so strong it made uncertainty bearable. And that realization cast a harsh light on Daniel's own life, where relationships had been traded for ambition without a second thought. He began to ask himself questions he had avoided for years, questions about what kind of legacy he was creating and whether success meant anything if it required blindness to the humanity of others. Back at the company, Daniel called for comprehensive internal reviews, not as symbolic gestures, but as genuine efforts to understand the structure he had helped shape. He sat through briefings that exposed disparities in pay, benefits, and safety standards, listening as managers defended long-standing practices with language that suddenly sounded hollow. Numbers were presented, projections debated, but Daniel found himself thinking about a janitor working night shifts to raise a child alone, about how close that life had come to ending without acknowledgement. When resistance surfaced, when board members questioned the cost of change, Daniel spoke with a conviction that surprised even himself, explaining that the true cost was measured not in dollars but in lives, in trust lost and dignity eroded. His words were not polished or strategic. They were raw, driven by an awakening he could no longer suppress. Meanwhile, the city moved on, indifferent to the quiet transformation unfolding within one man and one company. News outlets briefly covered the shooting, framing it as an act of heroism before moving on to the next story. But Daniel refused to let Ethan become a footnote. He ensured Lily's needs were met without fanfare, arranging support quietly so it would never feel like charity, understanding that dignity mattered as much as assistance. He spoke with teachers, counselors, and doctors, learning how to be present without overstepping, careful not to replace a father, but determined to protect what that father cherished most. Each interaction forced Daniel further out of his comfort zone, teaching him lessons no business school ever had. As Ethan's condition slowly stabilized, though recovery remained uncertain, Daniel began spending time with employees across all levels of the organization, not as a CEO conducting inspections, but as a listener. He walked through departments he had never visited, introduced himself without titles, and asked people about their work, their challenges, their lives beyond the office. At first, the conversations were cautious, shaped by years of distance, but gradually honesty surfaced, revealing frustrations and hopes that had long gone unheard. Daniel listened, absorbing stories of missed family moments, of loyalty given without recognition, of pride mixed with exhaustion, and with every story, he felt the gap between leadership and labor narrow. He understood then that culture was not defined by slogans or policies, but by whether people felt seen, and that he had failed to see them for far too long. Late one night, Daniel returned to the hallway where everything had changed, standing alone beneath bright lights that erased shadows but could not erase memory. The floor had been cleaned, polished until it reflected his image perfectly, yet he could still picture the blood, the sudden violence that had stripped away his illusions. He imagined Ethan walking that same path countless times, unnoticed, carrying responsibility without recognition, and he felt a deep, humbling gratitude mixed with resolve. That hallway became a symbol, not of fear, but of accountability, a reminder that leadership demanded presence even when it was uncomfortable. When Ethan finally regained enough strength to speak in full sentences, Daniel was there, listening as he apologized for worrying Lily, as if surviving had somehow inconvenienced others. The apology stunned Daniel, revealing a humility that contrasted sharply with the entitlement he had grown accustomed to among powerful circles. He assured Ethan that Lily was safe, that nothing would be taken from her, but Ethan's concern went deeper, touching on missed school days, on the fear of being absent when his daughter needed him. Daniel realized that recovery for Ethan was not just physical but emotional, shaped by the weight of responsibility he carried even while lying in a hospital bed. Inspired by that sense of responsibility, Daniel pushed further with reforms, introducing policies that valued time as much as output, recognizing that people could not give endlessly without support. Flexible schedules, healthcare expansions, and educational opportunities became realities rather than proposals, reshaping the company's identity from within. Critics questioned the sustainability of such changes, but Daniel felt grounded by a clarity he had never known, certain that success built on respect would endure far longer than profit driven by neglect. Employees began to respond not just with productivity, but with renewed commitment, proving that trust, once earned, could transform an organization in ways spreadsheets could not capture. As weeks turned into months, Ethan began physical therapy, each step a painful reminder of the night that had altered his life. Daniel visited whenever he could, offering encouragement without pressure, respecting Ethan's independence even as he provided support. Their conversations were simple, centered on Lily, on recovery, on the ordinary moments Ethan longed to return to, yet beneath those exchanges lay a shared understanding that neither spoke aloud. Ethan had saved Daniel's life, but in doing so, he had also given Daniel a chance to become someone better, someone worthy of the future he now envisioned for the company and for himself. By the time Ethan was strong enough to leave the hospital, Daniel stood beside him, not as a symbol of corporate power, but as a man changed by humility. The journey ahead remained uncertain, filled with challenges both personal and professional, but Daniel felt ready to face them with a perspective forged not in boardrooms, but in a hospital corridor and a quiet act of courage. He understood that the story unfolding was no longer just about survival, but about responsibility, redemption, and the profound truth that one selfless choice could ripple outward, reshaping lives far beyond its moment, carrying meaning that neither man could have imagined when fate first drew them together. Ethan's return home did not feel like a victory so much as a fragile beginning, a careful step into a life that no longer resembled the one he had left behind on the night of the shooting. His apartment smelled the same, carried the same quiet echoes of long nights and early mornings, yet every movement reminded him of what his body had endured. Pain followed him like a shadow, settling into his muscles and bones, turning simple actions into deliberate efforts. But Ethan accepted it without complaint, because pain meant he was alive, and being alive meant he could still keep his promise to Lily. She hovered near him constantly, watching his every movement with a seriousness that didn't belong to a child her age, ready to fetch water, pillows, or nothing at all if it meant staying close. Ethan noticed how she listened more carefully now, how she flinched at sudden sounds, and guilt pressed against his chest harder than the wound ever had because he knew his sacrifice had left marks on her too. Daniel ensured that Ethan's recovery was never burdened by financial fear, though he was careful to do it quietly, arranging support through structures that preserved Ethan's dignity rather than turning him into a symbol. Physical therapy sessions became part of Ethan's routine, slow and grueling, filled with moments of frustration that tested his patience more than pain ever had. On days when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him, he thought of Lily's small hand gripping his, of her unwavering belief that he would get better, and that belief carried him forward step by step. Daniel visited occasionally, never announcing himself, never overstaying, sitting in the background while Ethan worked through exercises that looked insignificant but demanded immense effort. In those moments, Daniel learned more about resilience than he ever had in years of leadership training. Watching a man who had already given everything continue to fight not for recognition, but for the simple right to be present in his daughter's life. At the company, the changes Daniel had initiated began to ripple outward, unsettling established hierarchies and long-held assumptions. Managers who had built their authority on distance struggled to adapt, while employees who had learned to keep their heads down cautiously tested the sincerity of the new culture. Daniel faced resistance that was subtle rather than overt, questions framed as concerns about efficiency, warnings about setting precedents that could not be sustained. He listened, acknowledged the risks, and moved forward anyway, guided by the understanding that leadership without courage was merely management in disguise. He spent more time on the floor than in his office, attending team meetings unannounced, asking questions without agendas, and listening to answers without interrupting. Slowly, trust began to form, tentative but real, as people realized that this shift was not a performance, but a commitment. Ethan's story circulated quietly within the company, not as a legend polished for public consumption, but as a shared truth that reshaped how people saw one another. Janitors, security guards, assistants, and analysts began exchanging greetings, learning names, acknowledging presence, small acts that collectively altered the atmosphere of the building. Ethan never sought the attention, uncomfortable whenever someone thanked him, insisting he had only done what anyone should do. But those words carried weight precisely because they came without pride. To many employees, he became a mirror reflecting the values they wanted to believe in, proof that integrity did not depend on position. Daniel watched this transformation with humility, recognizing that the culture he was trying to build could never be mandated from the top, but had to be lived by the people within it. As months passed, Ethan's strength returned gradually, unevenly, marked by setbacks that tested his resolve. Some nights, pain woke him before dawn, and he sat quietly at the kitchen table, listening to the city stir, wondering whether he would ever be able to return to work in any capacity. The question frightened him, not because of pride, but because work had always been his way of contributing, of maintaining balance between receiving help and giving something back. Daniel sensed this unspoken worry and began exploring options that aligned with Ethan's abilities rather than his limitations, roles that valued experience, observation, and care over physical strain. He did not present these ideas as favors, but as opportunities, understanding that dignity mattered as much as security. Lily returned to school carrying invisible weight, her teachers noticing a new seriousness beneath her quiet demeanor. Daniel arranged counseling support, again without ceremony, ensuring Lily had space to process fear she did not yet have words for. Ethan watched his daughter navigate emotions beyond her years and felt both pride and sorrow, aware that innocence, once shaken, never fully returns. He spoke to her honestly when she asked difficult questions, telling her that being brave did not mean being unafraid, but choosing love even when fear existed. Those conversations strengthened their bond, transforming shared vulnerability into trust that ran deeper than before. At work, Daniel faced a pivotal challenge when a major investor questioned the company's new direction, citing increased costs and reduced short-term margins. The pressure was intense, carrying the familiar threat of instability that Daniel had once feared above all else. This time, however, his response was different. He spoke not just of long-term gains, but of responsibility, of sustainability rooted in human well-being, explaining that a company built on disregard would eventually collapse under its own weight. His words were measured but unwavering, shaped by experience rather than theory, and though not everyone was convinced, enough were to allow the changes to continue. Walking out of that meeting, Daniel felt a quiet certainty settle within him, knowing that whatever the outcome, he was finally aligned with his own values. Ethan reached a turning point during physical therapy when he managed to walk unassisted for the first time, the effort leaving him breathless and trembling. Lily clapped softly from the corner, her eyes shining with pride, and Daniel, watching from the doorway, felt a swell of emotion that surprised him. That simple moment embodied everything he had learned since the shooting, progress measured not by speed or scale, but by perseverance and support. Ethan smiled, not triumphant, but grateful, aware that every step forward was shared, built on the care of others. Eventually, Daniel offered Ethan a position within the company that focused on mentoring and internal support, a role shaped around observation, safety awareness, and employee well-being. Ethan considered the offer carefully, weighing his desire to contribute against the fear of being treated differently. When he accepted, It was with the condition that he be allowed to work quietly, without ceremony or spotlight, wanting to earn his place through effort rather than circumstance. Daniel agreed, understanding that the power of Ethan's presence lay in authenticity rather than recognition. As Ethan began this new chapter, he walked through the building with fresh perspective, no longer invisible yet still grounded in humility. He listened to concerns others felt unheard, offered guidance born from experience rather than authority, and reminded people through simple actions that every role mattered. Employees responded not because he had saved the CEO, but because he treated them with respect, reinforcing the culture Daniel hoped would endure beyond any single leader. Late one evening, after the building had emptied and the city lights glowed softly through the windows, Daniel and Ethan stood together in the hallway where everything had changed. There were no speeches, no formal acknowledgments, just shared silence filled with understanding. Ethan looked at the polished floor and then at Daniel, expressing gratitude not for survival, but for the chance to keep moving forward with purpose. Daniel listened, aware that the journey ahead would never be perfect, but confident that it would be guided by a truth forged in sacrifice and compassion. In that quiet moment, both men understood that redemption was not a destination reached through grand gestures, but a daily commitment to seeing others, honoring their humanity, and choosing courage even when it demanded more than comfort, setting the stage for a future shaped not by fear or power, but by shared responsibility and hope. The months that followed settled into a rhythm that felt both unfamiliar and quietly hopeful, as though life itself was learning how to breathe again after holding its breath for too long. Ethan's body continued to heal in slow, uneven stages, each day demanding patience rather than strength, and he accepted that lesson with the same humility that had shaped every part of his life. He returned home each evening, tired but fulfilled, no longer carrying the crushing fear that a single misstep could undo everything he had built for Lily. Instead, there was a steadiness to his days, a sense of purpose rooted not in survival alone, but in contribution. Lily noticed the change before he did, remarking one night as they shared dinner that her father smiled differently now. Not the tired smile meant to reassure, but one that reached his eyes. Ethan laughed softly at that, realizing how much of his life had been spent pretending not to be afraid, and how freeing it felt to finally stand on ground that did not shift beneath his feet. At the company, the transformation Daniel had begun grew deeper roots, extending beyond policies into the unspoken ways people treated one another. Meetings no longer opened with silent tension, but with conversation. Questions asked without fear of dismissal, disagreements handled with respect rather than dominance. The building itself felt changed, not because of renovation or design, but because of presence, because people felt acknowledged rather than tolerated. Daniel moved through these spaces with a humility that would have been unthinkable to his former self, greeting employees by name, listening without impatience, and allowing moments of imperfection to exist without immediately trying to control them. Leadership, he discovered, was not about standing above others, but about standing with them, sharing responsibility rather than hoarding authority. Ethan's role within the company remained deliberately understated, shaped by his desire to be useful rather than celebrated. He became someone people sought out quietly, not because he had saved the CEO, but because he listened without judgment and spoke with honesty grounded in lived experience. He noticed things others overlooked: a guard working double shifts without complaint, an assistant struggling to balance work and family, a technician hesitant to raise safety concerns. When Ethan spoke, people listened, sensing that his words were never meant to elevate himself, only to protect others from harm. Daniel watched these interactions with a sense of gratitude that bordered on reverence, understanding that no executive initiative could have created what Ethan embodied naturally. Lily flourished in subtle ways that revealed how deeply the storm had passed through her young life. She became more thoughtful, more attentive to others' feelings, carrying empathy that mirrored her father's without fully understanding where it came from. Counseling helped her name fears she had kept silent, and Ethan learned alongside her, discovering that strength did not mean shielding loved ones from every truth, but walking with them through uncertainty. Their bond deepened into something resilient and tender, built on shared honesty rather than quiet sacrifice. When Lily spoke about her father at school, she did so without drama or pride, simply describing him as someone who helped people, and that simplicity reflected the values Ethan hoped would guide her future. As the company's reputation shifted, attention followed, not in the form of sensational headlines, but through steady recognition of ethical leadership and sustainable practices. Analysts took notice, investors recalibrated expectations, and competitors watched carefully, unsure whether this new direction was an anomaly or the beginning of a broader change. Daniel remained focused not on perception, but on consistency, knowing that trust once broken was difficult to rebuild and that the true measure of progress would be endurance. He faced setbacks, moments when growth slowed or criticism sharpened, but he met them with patience rather than panic, grounded in the understanding that some gains could not be rushed without losing their meaning. One evening, Daniel invited Ethan and Lily to a small gathering marking the anniversary of the night that had altered all their lives. There was no stage, no speeches prepared for the press, only a quiet acknowledgement among those who understood what had been at stake. Ethan hesitated before attending, uncomfortable with attention, but Lily's curiosity and gentle insistence persuaded him. Standing together in the softly lit space, Daniel spoke briefly, not of heroism, but of responsibility, crediting the company's renewed direction to a reminder that had come at great cost. Ethan listened with humility, his hand resting lightly on Lily's shoulder, grateful not for recognition, but for the respect woven into Daniel's words. Later that night, as the building emptied and echoes returned to the halls, Ethan found himself standing once more in the corridor where everything had changed. The floor gleamed under bright lights, free of any visible trace of violence, yet memory lingered, not as fear, but as quiet reverence. Daniel joined him, and they stood together in silence, neither feeling the need to fill it. Ethan spoke first, reflecting on how close he had come to leaving his daughter alone, and how strange it felt to be standing there alive, surrounded by possibility rather than loss. Daniel listened, acknowledging the weight of that truth, aware that survival carried its own responsibility, one that demanded humility and gratitude every day. In time, Ethan's life settled into a balance he had never thought possible, one where work and family coexisted without constant sacrifice. Lily grew, her laughter filling their apartment, her dreams shaped by security rather than fear. Daniel, too, found a different kind of fulfillment, no longer chasing validation through relentless achievement, but measuring success through connection and integrity. He learned to step away, to trust others, to allow leadership to be shared rather than centralized, understanding that no organization thrived on the strength of one person alone. Years later, when new employees joined the company, they heard stories not of a fearless CEO or record-breaking profits, but of a culture built on respect and shared humanity. Some knew the details of the night a janitor took a bullet meant for someone else. Others only felt the legacy of that moment in the way they were treated. Ethan never corrected anyone's assumptions, never sought to frame his actions as extraordinary, believing instead that decency should never be considered rare. Daniel, reflecting on the journey, understood that the true miracle was not survival, but transformation, the way one selfless act had revealed the humanity hidden beneath ambition and power. On a quiet afternoon, long after the scars had faded and life had moved forward, Ethan and Lily walked through a park, the sunlight filtering gently through trees, laughter echoing around them. Lily asked her father why people helped one another even when it was hard, and Ethan answered simply that kindness was a choice, one that often mattered most when no one was watching. As they walked hand in hand, the weight of the past felt lighter, not because it had been forgotten, but because it had been woven into a future shaped by compassion rather than fear. And somewhere beyond that park, within walls once defined by distance and indifference, a company continued to grow, guided by a lesson learned at great cost, that the fate of any institution, like the fate of any life, is ultimately determined not by power or profit, but by the courage to see and value the humanity of others, even in moments when it demands everything.